everyone. It is bang on 2 o'clock according to my iPhone. So we shall begin. First of all, welcome everyone. I know some of you have made a real effort to be here, so thank you so much for coming. As you can probably see, we're pretty much fully booked, but there will be some people coming in late. Just be gracious and nice Christian people and let them come in. Let's just be nice. First of all, I really want to welcome all of you here. Thank you again for coming. I want to especially make a mention of the President of the Methodist Conference, Mickey Youngson, that is, there you are, is here, and also Vice President Bala, sorry if this is all wrong, Anana Pagazan, who is, there you are. Thank you so much for coming and supporting us in this endeavor. Now, my name is Kirsi Cobb. I'm the lecturer of biblical studies here at Cliff College. I'm also a co-founder with Holly Morse of the Bible, Gender and Church Research Center, but more about that in a little bit. So, before we begin, there are a couple of just housekeeping things I just need to let you know. First of all, there is one fire exit. That's it. Okay. Do not try the windows. We tried. They do not open. They don't believe in such things. So there is only one fire exit just through there. And basically there is a fire assembly point on just on the other side of that big tent out there. So if there is a fire alarm, just be nice and calm. Proceed in a nice orderly fashion out through that door. Also, what I need to let you know is that, as you can see, the title of today's talk, Researching Faith with Survivors of Abuse, is a difficult one. So this is your official trigger warning that this speech will handle some difficult topics and some touchy subjects. So if you feel the need that you need to leave the room, that is absolutely fine. We also have some pastoral care available right at the back. So Ali, can you just wave? Yeah, Ali and Co. They are available right at the back. So if you feel the need, please go to them. Another thing is that these speeches will be filmed, but they are filmed as if the speeches are filmed, so you cannot be seen. I'm sorry, you will not be rich and famous after this, but they will be filmed, so just to make you aware of that. Also to let you know just about the order of how today is going to go. So first we have the main speaker, Susan Schutter, giving her paper, followed then by myself and then Holly Morse. We also then have a Q&A session at the end of that, which is then followed by the reception, for which Sandra, who is a colleague of mine, and I have no idea where she is, she's helping me out, she has baked 48 muffins. I mean, that's commitment, right? So we'll enjoy those during the reception. Now, about BGC. What on earth is this? Bible, Gender and Church Research Center. This started off. Hi Pamela, sorry, I said I wasn't going to be horrible. She's a research student here at Cliff College, so she has a special place in my heart. So, BGC, how did it start? It started because in my own research, I researched gender, women, trauma, all of that kind of stuff. And I found out that when I was teaching about women in the Bible here at Cliff, or when I would talk about women in the Bible with fellow churchgoers at church, there seemed to be quite a huge discrepancy between what was going on in the world of biblical studies and what was actually going on in the churches that I and other people attended. So then the dream came that what if we could bring the world of biblical studies and what is actually happening in the lives of people who go to church, what if we could bring them together? And that is what we are here trying to do. Together with the University of Manchester and Cliff College, we really want to look at the real lived reality of people who go to church, whether it's now or in the past, and see how the ideas of biblical studies and gender kind of relate together. And that is what today's paper is also about, and more about that just in a minute. Now, to let you know about future plans. Future plans for BGC after this inaugural lecture are currently as follows. We are planning to do 1 to 2 conferences next year, also on the theme of abuse and the Bible. Details about that will become available on the Cliff College website, or if you follow myself or Holly on Twitter, they will become available. We are literally planning these things right at this moment. 2 other things that I want to make you aware of. One is the conference about BIAPT. BIAPT is the British and Irish Association for Practical Theology. They have their 25th anniversary conference coming up in July, and you can find out about this event on their website, or there are a couple of programs in the foyer on the table. This is meant to be their biggest conference yet, so if you can, please attend. Another thing I want to make you aware of, and this is something that both Susan and myself are part of, this is the Faith Lives of Women and Girls Symposium, which is run by Nicole Slee at Queen's Foundation in Birmingham. If you want to know more about how the faith life of women and girls is being researched and what's happening and what's current, this is a very good symposium to be part of. There are some cards for this available again on the table outside. Right. And it is at this point then that I want to introduce the future speakers here. First of all, I would like Holly just to mention a couple of things about herself.
Hi, so I'm Holly Morse. I'm a lecturer in Bible, Gender and Culture at the University of Manchester, and my research work is on, unsurprisingly, gender and biblical studies, specifically the Hebrew Bible and the reception of biblical texts through the ages.
Excellent. Yeah, that's great, and we'll look forward to hearing Holly's response in a little bit. And it is now my great pleasure then to welcome Rev'd Dr. Susan Shooter as the main speaker for the inaugural lecture for the BGC. So, ordained in 1996 in the Diocese of Rochester in the Church of England, she served 2 curacies and was incumbent for 9 years. Also tutoring on diocesan lay training courses. For 2 years she was biblical strand leader for the Canterbury Christ Church Certificate in Theology for Ministry. Busy gal. In 2011 she successfully completed her DMin thesis with King's College London. Her dissertation was subsequently published by Routledge in 2012 and is entitled How Survivors of Abuse Relate to God, the Authentic Spirituality of the Annihilated. So, yeah, that word. In her work, she touches some of the many biblical, theological, and practical issues raised by abuse, and how the contemporary church may wish to address these issues. So, it is on this subject that we also welcome her to speak today. Her paper is entitled, Yet in My Flesh Shall I See God, Researching Faith with Survivors of Abuse. Welcome.
Well, thank you for your welcome, and thank you for the invitation. It's a while since we've been in Derbyshire. We did used to live here, but it's nice to hear some proper vowels again. I'm very encouraged and very excited about this centre that Holly and Kirsi have cooperated in forming. A centre that I hope will be committed to grappling with issues raised by how our gender influences our faith, our learning, our reading of the Bible, and our experiences of church. My first contact came with Kirsi when we met on Skype to discuss the practical issues about how to research faith with vulnerable people. But today I'm going to speak about the results and implications of my study with survivors of abuse. As Kirsi said, some of the stories you might find a little upsetting at times, but I hope you'll also find some of them uplifting. Okay, God, you're not going to bail us out then? I'm sure you'll still be there for me when it's over. When it's over. I didn't say to God, be with me in it. I remember saying, right, I'll drown, that's it, I'll give up. The waters will go over my head, and if I'm still alive at the end of all this, you can have what's left. I did learn that he was walking along the bottom of the river with me, holding my hands. But I wouldn't have known that before. That is an excerpt from Lydia's interview. She was sharing what she'd written in her journal during the most devastating period in her life. Lydia was one of 9 volunteers who took part in my study about how Christian survivors relate to God. I wanted to find out how faith survives when it comes up against pain, darkness and chaos. Survivors like Lydia had seldom been heard in academic theology or within the church. And I felt it was time for survivors to come to the microphone and speak their truth. Esther was another interviewee, and she said, "Forgiveness is not the sort of thing you do as a one-off thing. On a nice day, forgiveness is easy. It comes with the sun. But on a nasty day, all your things come out of the woodwork and you have to do your forgiveness all over again. People say, you forgive and forget. I'm afraid I don't agree with that," she said. As a child, Esther had been in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. Later, she married a man who was a pillar of her church community. From him, she received various broken bones, including a smashed eye socket and a fractured spine. Once, he dragged her by the feet across the living room carpet, so one side of her face was burnt. Yet even after hearing of such horrendous abuse, has anybody got a little voice in their head saying, yes, but it is important to forgive and forget, isn't it? Time and again, survivors are exhorted to forgive their abuser. And when they can't, their inability to forgive is used as another stick to beat them with. It's their fault if they're not healed. Marie Fortune, who pioneered research on domestic violence and sexual abuse within Christianity, reminds us that forgive and forget is not even a biblical concept. It comes from King Lear. And she says that this simplistic formula allows Christians to ignore the difficulty of grappling with the complex power dynamics involved in true forgiveness. It can also be devastating to be told that the abuse is all in God's plan. Priscilla said, "I've struggled with the idea some Christians have, that God allows things to happen to make you a better person. I find that quite insulting to God. I cannot imagine any loving father would allow a child to go through what I went through in order for them to be something when they grew up." For years, Priscilla was sexually abused by her grandfather. The three women I've quoted, Esther, Lydia and Priscilla, have biblical names. I chose pseudonyms from Scripture for all my research participants to honour the women who rarely got to tell their own stories, yet have been present throughout our faith history. Take, for example, in the book of Genesis, Hagar is the first woman after Eve recorded as having an experience of God's presence. If we want to understand Hagar's experience, what it was like to be raped and abused by a patriarch and a matriarch, it's worth reading Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale. What happens to Offred and the other handmaids of dystopian Gilead is Hagar's context. Her fertile body is exploited to provide a son for the infertile leaders of society. Hagar's story is one of abuse, embedded in and condoned by the cultural and social system. Some women in the Bible aren't even named, like the concubine in Judges 19, who is given to be raped to death in the street. also that her Levite master and their host are not dishonoured as men. Throughout Scripture, women's bodies are sacrificed, used and abused. Yet at the heart of our Christian faith, we are shown the body of a crucified man who is worshipped as triumphant Lord. Church history has been no more inclusive of female voices than the Bible. Now, all of you will have heard of Martin Luther. Heard him? Some of you will know that Martin Luther's big idea was justification by faith alone. Now, hands up. Who's heard of Marguerite Porete? Anybody? 3 people, and 2 of them are my family, or 4. They're always hearing about her. At the end of the 13th century, 200 years before Luther spearheaded the Reformation, Porete wrote a book about the soul who is saved by faith without works. Challenging the virtue system of penances and indulgences brought her before the Inquisition. She also believed that sin is not caused by our natural bodies. Marguerite Porete was called a pseudo-woman by her persecutors because she dared to do theology like a man. True story. Her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, survived her and was passed down anonymously. For centuries, it was thought to have been written by a man, and as such, in its first modern translation last century, it received the Benedictine imprimatur. Somehow they didn't realise it was written by a condemned heretic. Yee. Whoever holds the pen, the professor's chair, the pulpit, the microphone, decides who we get to hear from. Knowledge in its creation have long been jealously guarded, and science and religion are often seen at odds. Yet both are cultural activities which seek understanding. Now, the social sciences can bridge some of that perceived gap. They offer us a tool for applying academic rigour to questions of religious inquiry. Nicola Slee broke new ground. She pointed out that qualitative research, that's research that explores underlying meanings, occupies shared ground with the praxis model of theology. That is, both begin with story and lived experience, and then go on to reflect analytically on that experience. Professor Slee's work challenged theories of faith development, such as James Fowler's. Slee questioned Fowler's influential work because it took men's experience as the norm. By analysing women's own words and their speech patterns, she created a theory about how women practice their spiritual lives, and she discovered important differences. For example, though women value connection and attachment over individuation, that does not mean that their faith is less mature. For various approaches to empirical research using feminist methodologies, researching women's faith, I've got a copy if anybody wants to have a look at it afterwards, is a collection of different research projects. Kirsi mentioned the research symposium earlier. That came, well, this is the second volume that came out of that symposium. And in chapter 9, if you want to see a succinct description of how I developed my research design, you'll find it in there. And I used the analytical tool of grounded theory, but I'm not going to go into all that now because it'll bore you. Methodologies can get quite boring, so I'll skip that bit. So why did I want to know what abused people might reveal about God that can be brought to bear on theology and scripture? Well, a hallmark of feminist research is reflexivity. In other words, knowledge cannot be separated from the knower. So the researcher admits her place within it. Now, I have met many people, both inside and outside of the church, who are survivors. And as with the hashtag #MeToo movement, I acknowledge that I am a survivor too. And when it came to empirical research about survivor spirituality, there seemed to be a resounding silence. Now, it's hard to reel all the way back and remember that there was this silence about abuse only a short while ago. I published my book, this one here, in August 2012. And that was 3 months before an important watershed of the 3rd of October 2012. That was the beginning of a sea change in our culture when ITV showed a documentary called Exposure, The Other Side of Jimmy Savile. And we started to learn that survivors' voices in our institutions were actively silenced. And churches, I'm afraid, were no exception. Winston Churchill famously said, "We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us." But before buildings and institutions, we had stories. And it was our stories, our founding myths, that shaped us. Now, the church is one of, if not the major holder, of the stories which formed our culture. James Poling is a psychologist and minister who has worked with survivors and with perpetrators of abuse, and he argues that patriarchal theologies at the base of our Western culture have led to the underlying adult male identification with Father God. This masculine God gives those in power rights and privileges, and this in turn creates a society which refuses to identify with the vulnerable. Now, Poling's insight calls us to realise that the abuse of power is therefore a theological as well as a practical problem. Yet, even after some terrible experiences, some survivors still retain their faith. And I wanted to know what this faith is like and what is the context that forms it. Now, I want to tell you a little story about context. A friend of mine went as a mission partner to the Sudan as a maths teacher. She tried to tackle with the girls what she saw as cheating. Whenever she tested them, she would catch them telling each other the answers. All came to a head one day. She was angry, the girls were upset, and they said, "But miss, do you want us all to fail?" It took my friend some time to learn that if one member of that community failed, in their eyes all of them had failed. Their lives as a community depended on them all helping each other out. Cheating was just not a concept for them. It was not part of their survival story. To allow the women who volunteered for my study to tell their own story in their own way, I asked open-ended questions so they could take the telling in whichever direction they wanted to. Now, Joanna, at the end of her interview, thanked me for that. She said she had never had the opportunity to talk about her experiences without someone butting in and asking silly questions. all the women said that this was the first time they'd been able to talk at length about their abuse in relation to their faith. Either because no one was interested in listening to their story, or because the subject of abuse had been seen by others, particularly in the church, as taboo, or the respondent herself felt she had not had enough courage to share her story before. Now, the 17 hours of interview material that they gave me was a precious gift. And within those transcripts lay the clues that would lead me to a theory that I believe encapsulated survivor spirituality. Throughout the 9 interviews, the ideas that cropped up again and again were centred around 3 main concepts. And the first was God's timeless presence. There are over 150 references to that in 9 interviews. Phrases like, God is in everything, God has always been there, God was holding my hand. When talking about her time in the camps, Esther said, that's why that sentence we say in church is important. When we were far off, God was there. When I really didn't know anything about God, he was there, I was his child. I was precious to him even then. And gradually I've seen glimpses of him. And you see glimpses particularly when you go through the valleys in life. I've had some fantastic mountaintop experiences, but it's in the valley that you really meet God, isn't it? Now, though many of the women were sceptical about religious experiences, they did report some special moments. Naomi thought people would say stuff and nonsense about this. She said there was somebody here who I knew was heavenly. Whether it was God or whether it was an angel, I don't know, but it was a real presence. There was this overwhelming feeling of being loved. I can't explain it any better than that. If I had stayed there any longer, I just felt that my heart would burst. Through awareness of God's timeless presence, the women found transformation. That was the second major concept. Anger was often seen as transformative because it moved the survivor on. Joanna said, I was screaming at God saying, I don't want you in my life. I don't want you anywhere near me. I'm told you're my father. If you were my father, you wouldn't stand there and watch somebody rape me. And I was really angry with God. But by the evening, I was in floods of tears, asking God to come back in my life. I didn't want to be without him. And I realised that it wasn't God's fault. It was this man and not God's. Priscilla talked about the transformation of evil into good. She said, I don't think God let the abuse happen, but when it did happen, I think he was then able to change that, transform that into something that was good. So that out of that pain and out of that evil, good actually came. Inasmuch as I was then able to talk to other people and get close to other people. The older I get, the more I see the good that's come out of it. It took me a long time, yeah, but it wasn't all wasted. Now this leads me to the third important concept within survivor spirituality. Knowing ministry. Now Lydia was a radiotherapist in her work. She said, in my job I'm interacting with people at the end of their life. Young people at the end of their life, people who are having a real shit time. And I know what not to say, because the reality of it is no one can walk your path. No one can do your experience. When you sit alongside someone, even if it's a similar journey, it's not your journey, it's theirs, and how they experience it is different. But if they know that you know, I think that they find it easier for you to sit alongside them. But I still don't think it gives you the permission to say what it's like for them. And you can't take it away either. The transformation that these survivors undergo seems to be enabling them to serve others with a non-invasive, non-judgmental, empathetic quality. And many of them do have strong prayer ministries and counselling skills. So I understood at the end of this that the process of the survivor's spirituality could be seen as knowing God's timeless presence transforms. They have discovered that God's presence has been with them and transformed them throughout their lives. And because the survivors know this transformation, it empowers them to be truly present in the service of others, which in turn may bring further transformation to the world. My next step was to interrogate the Christian tradition from the point of view of this survivor spirituality. And the first thing I did was to apply what I'd learned to the book of Job, the archetypal innocent sufferer. Now, for those of you wondering about my choice of a male dialogue partner, there were two simple reasons, really. First of all, there are no reflections of such length and depth about traumatic experience by a female voice in Scripture. So I was a bit stumped, really. But secondly, when I advertised for volunteers for this study, there was no bar on male survivors. It's a fair critique to ask, why are there no men in my sample? It wasn't just because I'm a feminist and I wanted to interview women. The simple answer is, in order not to be coercive, my sample of interviewees had to be self-selecting and people unknown to me. That was so that it wasn't coercive. And no men volunteered. Enabling men to speak about abuse would be a project of real importance. All bodies are precious, and there's plenty of violence carried out on male bodies in our culture. Ex-squaddies, many of whom are homeless, might be the ones who have a story to tell. But back to Job. I treated the 42 chapters of Job as an integrated story of one person's traumatic experience. And I applied the three concepts that I've described to Job's words. From the moment he loses all his children and his possessions. Now Lydia, who was sexually abused as a small child by an uncle, explained that when she addressed this experience for the first time in connection with her faith, that there was still no sense of pain from the abuse itself. The crunch came when her husband was charged with sexual offences against children in his scout group. She says, it was then I began to experience a lot of pain. How did the children interpret it? How did I interpret abuse? I then began to experience the pain that I'd had when I was a child. Lydia was exposed to the mortification of both positions, for although she was no perpetrator herself, she was exposed on the one hand to the pain of accusation as the wife of an abuser. Her painful questioning lasted throughout her husband's trial and prison sentence. And it had a striking correlation with Job's doubt and anguish following his second round of losses, when the pain breaks through his skin and starts eating into his flesh. Lydia's story of being caught between those two extremes of surviving child sexual abuse and involvement with the perpetrator broke open a new possibility about Job's status. Should we read Job as a survivor or as a recovering perpetrator? In chapter 1 of Job, Satan complained that God had put a hedge around Job, that Job's possessions had broken limits in the land. So Job was well defended from harm, whilst he ventured over the boundaries of others. This is the classic profile of an abuser. And then we hear later of Job's mistreatment of the disempowered. We know he was someone who used to take advantage of the weak. So Job's devastation might not only represent a survivor's struggle, but also the recovery of a perpetrator. But of course, such recovery rarely happens because of the horror a perpetrator must face in accepting their own accountability. The next question I asked of the text of Job is, does he undergo transformation? Lydia said this about herself. She said, you think you're all right, don't you? I was one of those who would play in the worship group and it wouldn't matter if my kids were ill. I'd have to be there. All of my energies were focused on serving God all of the time because that's what gave me peace. Now in the prologue to Job, Yahweh was very, very remote from Job. There wasn't any direct communication. But by the end, in the epilogue, there's that direct communication between Job and his God. And at the beginning, there was also a distance between Job and others. He didn't eat with his family, but made scrupulous sacrifices for them in their absence, whether they needed it or not. But in the epilogue at the end, the community gathers with him, and now he eats with his family and former acquaintances, opening up his table and his home. Lydia said this about the differences in herself. She said, back then, if you came into my house, you could have really eaten your dinner off the kitchen floor. I was obsessively immaculate. I wore myself out keeping it clean. I only had peace if I felt clean, and of course I felt very dirty. Now, if anybody who knew me then and hasn't seen me for years came into my house, they wouldn't believe it. We've got 4 dogs and it doesn't bother me. I don't have to clean anything now. It's a bit like my house. You remember how Priscilla questioned the idea that God allows things to happen to make you a better person? She said this about the incest. She said, the fact that God's used it, that it hasn't been wasted, that's a different thing. But you do hear this kind of talk, oh well, it's part of God's plan. I don't believe it was ever part of God's plan. I don't think it's part of his plan for anybody to go through that kind of pain. I don't believe that's part of his plan at all. Now this flies in the face of Job's comforters, his friends. Elihu tells the suffering Job that when God can't communicate in any other way, people are chastened with pain upon their beds and with continual strife in their bones. That is to say, Job's suffering is pedagogical. Job's silence before God at the end is often read as some sort of penitent shame. As some sort of penitent shame of God's rebuke. And I looked for evidence of God's discipline in Job. And there isn't really any. God ignores Elihu and what he said, and names Job as God's friend. Job responds to his special experience of God by saying, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Like Hagar, the slave woman, who says, I now have seen the one who sees me. Job, in his flayed flesh, has seen God just as he hoped. Appearing in that whirlwind, God carefully addresses what has been said, And that shows that God was actually present throughout all of Job's suffering. And God is one who listens. And this is reflected in Job's knowing ministry at the end. Like Lydia and the other interviewees, Job now has an important prayer ministry as intercessor. Now I want to tell you, before we move on from Job, about Miriam. Miriam was encouraged by her minister to become a pastoral assistant. One day she went to see a deceased member of her church in the chapel of rest, someone she'd known well. And it was at that moment of loss that the minister made his first sexual move on her. He continued to put enormous pressure on her to become his sexual partner. She felt totally confused and psychologically dismantled by him. For example, he interpreted scripture in a way that suggested adultery is sometimes God's will, because it was through David and Bathsheba's line that God would fulfill the divine purpose. When Miriam finally refused to be alone with the minister, she received a barrage of angry texts and emails from him. Eventually, she had no option but to leave her church. She lost her worshipping community. She lost her ministry. She lost her sense of God for a while. But in that traumatic sense of loss, she had this special experience. Everything broadened out where I thought Christians are not better than other people. Leaders are not better than people who aren't leaders. God is in everybody. God is in everything. God is in nature. I'm just as likely to find God down in Sainsbury's as in St. Peter's and Paul. It was almost like I don't believe in church anymore. It's like you're going from there are all these holy places to there are no holy places. All these places that are the streets and the cities are just as much God. I suppose what you're trying to do is get the whole thing to come together in the middle, where you're saying God is in all of it. Miriam's sense of the immanent God has resonance with Job's experience in the whirlwind. Boundaries with the divine are removed. And God shows how divine grace throughout creation is equally balanced between male and female. Subsequently, in the epilogue, Job establishes different community boundaries. Before, he was a man whose shadow crept over the boundaries of others, and around whom it seemed God had put a fence of entitlement. But now, he shows a commitment to equality in an act unprecedented in ancient Hebrew culture. He entitles his daughters to inherit along with his sons. The boundaries of convention are shockingly broken. Human society is healed. Now I want to show you just one last aspect of survivor faith, which was vital to them. When describing God, by far the most used word was love, or loving. Now earlier I mentioned Marguerite Perret, that nobody had heard of, a theologian who died in 1310. Her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, describes a 7-stage journey of faith in the company of God, whom she calls Lady Love. She described how the soul experiences total wretchedness and enters the abyss. There she is melted into God, transformed into divine love by the God of love, whose will then becomes her will. For Perret, this is the most mature state of spiritual development. In union with an absolutely generous God, the divine will is done through her, and from that point there is no going back. And it struck me that these are the very words that Lydia used about where she is now with God. the God who once walked along the riverbed with her. She said, I face only one way. Now, when I applied survivor spirituality to Perret's words, the comparison raised a shocking question. What if abuse, when boundaries of identity are violently overwhelmed by a perpetrator, can bring the survivor into the same relation with God as advanced mystical practice? I'm still struggling with this, folks. Because there are dangers that we must dance carefully with here. What I'm categorically not saying that it means that abuse should be sought in a masochistic way. Absolutely not. In fact, Marguerite Perret, that 13th century theologian, heavily criticised practices of bodily mortification, saying that was a false way to God. That made her very different from other female theologians of her time. In an age when flesh, particularly female flesh, was seen as sinful, it was little wonder that her flesh ended by being burnt at the stake. And so, in conclusion, engaging with raw material in both senses of the word, like survivor testimony, that is a two-edged sword. Breaking boundaries of knowledge is exciting and energising in a centre like this. It can also be painful and unnerving. But we can set up research so that the Church includes the voices of the disempowered and the silenced, no matter how shocking their words. And we can set it up in a way that does not compound the damage if we restrain our impulses to make our own ingrained and dominant narratives fit. A research centre for Bible, gender and church is a wonderful and timely opportunity to pay attention to the stories we haven't heard before, to view the stories which we thought we knew through new lenses, to think how our stories are affected by our embodied experiences, and to ask how the flesh we inhabit makes a difference to the way we see God. Now, I mentioned, I think, 6 of the 9 women I interviewed, and I put all their names up there.
Thank you, Susan, so much. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm actually just going to leave that there. I think that's kind of appropriate. Just to let you know that both mine and Holly's responses are quite significantly shorter, so fear not, you won't be here for the next 3 years. Just 3. Okay, so I shall start off now. So thank you, Susan, for these insights on a particularly difficult yet important topic. As a biblical studies scholar as well as an abuse survivor, and me too, I resonate with both the survivor experiences and the biblical issues raised. The collision of one's belief in a loving God with the harsh reality of personal suffering is often enough to shatter, or at least question, one's core beliefs. If God is God of love, to quote Philip Yancey's famous book title, where is God? When it hurts. Because it hurts. Where is God when heavens are quite literally made of brass and all you can hear back is the echo of your own pain? The voice of the abused is something that has yet to be heard in mainstream theology, and research such as Susan's sheds some much needed light on this topic. Some hope in this matter can be seen in the recent rise of biblical trauma studies. Although there is no generally agreed definition of trauma, the description by Shelley Rambo of trauma as, quote, the suffering that does not go away, end of quote, is helpful. Not hell, I almost said hellish. No, helpful. Trauma is understood as an experience or a series of experiences that overwhelm one's capacity to cope, to integrate that which has occurred into a coherent, meaningful narrative in time, memory, and/or bodily experiences. Not all suffering is necessarily traumatic. Rather, trauma is a wound that will not heal, but haunts the present with intrusive reminders of the past. The fact that it has taken this long for trauma to emerge in contemporary theological discourse is perhaps somewhat surprising, especially since, as David Carr notes, the Bible was formed, quote, in the context of centuries of catastrophic suffering, end of quote. Whether we speak of the crucifixion of Jesus, the destruction of Israel by Assyrian forces, or the attack on Judah by the Babylonians, the Bible is covered in violence and grief. True, we cannot necessarily assume that the experience of trauma is the same now as it was then, yet attending to possible traumatic elements in the biblical witness might grant us access to new aspects and understanding which may not have come to light without trauma studies. An example of this could be the prologue of the book of Job, as also referred to in Susan's paper. In Job chapters 1 and 2, God and Satan, the Satan, make a wager on Job's response to undeserved suffering. That an all-knowing, loving God would gamble with Satan, and in the process all but destroy Job, has somewhat unsurprisingly caused trouble among commentators. Several interpretations have been suggested, varying from the prologue being fiction, to justifying God's actions on the basis of the wager being understood as a cosmic dispute akin to the events in the Garden of Eden. In light of trauma studies, a slightly different twist is put on the narrative. In the work of Samuel Ballantyne, Job's suffering becomes a traumatized concession to, or assertion of, reality. In fact, even God himself admits that he has inflicted Job hinam without a cause, in Job 2:3. Bad things happen to good people, sometimes for no reason, and an inclusion of such experiences in the canon gives voice to those with similar experiences. I would suggest that such an emphasis shifts at least some of the focus of the prologue away from the actions of the divine to the audience of the book of Job. What the prologue offers is not necessarily a theological treatise of the mind of God, but rather an explanation of Job's suffering, or the suffering of the book's intended hearers and readers. Unlike the prophetic books that blame the sins of Israel and Judah for the disasters that followed, the book of Job externalizes the cause of suffering and hence lays emphasis not on the character of God, but on Job's response. Job is being tested, and his response to suffering matters. For a person going through traumatic events, such a message matters. It gives meaning to the incomprehensible and agency to a victim experiencing sometimes paralyzing helplessness. The fact that this might portray God as a gambler is of secondary importance. In the words of Kathleen O'Connor, believing that God is an active agent behind the events helps to understand the trauma and avoid the total collapse of one's worldview, even if such an understanding is incomplete and provisional. But how does any of this actually help? I mean, it's all really interesting because I love this stuff, but how does it actually help? In other words, recognizing that the Bible carries the hallmarks of trauma is one thing, but this can still be a step far removed from the lived reality of abuse and or trauma survivors, like we just heard. As also noted in Susan's paper, too often well-meaning Christians have approached the hurting with one or more of the usual Christian cliches of God is making you stronger, or God will give you more than you can bear. That's rubbish, by the way. All of which sounds very biblical, but is often of little use to those who are hurting. This is why research such as Susan's is so important. Sometimes we're so eager to get to the resurrection that we gloss over both Easter Friday and Saturday. In addition, we forget that in his resurrection body, Jesus still carried the signs of his crucifixion. The scars and the marks were not magically healed and covered up as if they had never been there. Rather, they became witness to the power that can cause a dead body to live again. The marks of Jesus' suffering were not silenced but redeemed, or to use Susan's word, transformed. These scars teach us not to gloss over suffering, but to remain with it. To understand what it is to experience violence and abuse, yet still reach out for hope. The hallmarks of suffering are also evident in the rest of the book of Job. Whilst seeing Job as a potential abuser, as suggested by Susan, might come as a shock, some of the other aspects may bear an easier witness to the experience of trauma survivors. One such notion is the feeling of God's presence, as evidenced at the end of the book of Job. Although I can certainly attest to experiencing God's presence during some of my most darkest hours, there is one aspect here that I wish to query, and that is the notion of divine absence. For most of the book, Job does not feel God's presence. He screams for God to explain himself, to show himself, but he is nothing back. Jesus' cry on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" also testifies to the experience of divine absence. While at times the comforting presence of the divine might well be felt, we must also account for at least the perceived or experienced notion of divine absence. As trauma overwhelms one's ability to cope, the feelings of isolation, absence, despair, and rage can all find their way into the experience of the sufferer. In fact, both Jesus and Job's cries of anguish might well teach us that to feel like this is not outside the experience of a faithful follower. Rather, these feelings are stages in the road mapped out by trauma. With patience and care, such an experience will one day, hopefully, result in the feeling of God's presence once more, but we cannot hurry there without experiencing the very long day between crucifixion and resurrection. The human psyche simply does not work that way. And as for Job, this experience of divine presence will not be the same as it was prior to his ordeal. After trauma, there is no going back to the world one left behind. Rather, this new orientation, as described by Walter Brueggemann in his study of the Book of Psalms, is a new paradigm, where beliefs previously held have been reevaluated, lost, or transformed. Such transformation is also described at the end of the book of Job. Job comes out of his ordeal in many ways a changed man. The one aspect of this change that I wish to look at is a line from Job's speech just after the famous phrase, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." In the following line, in Job 42:6, Job states, "Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." This is the NIV translation. Anyway, the Hebrew in this phrase is notoriously difficult to translate, and several interpretations are possible. I myself have partial affinity to the translation offered by Lindsay Wilson. He translates the phrase as, "I reject and turn away from lamenting." To go into the details of interpretation, we sadly do not have time for, but Wilson's interpretation emphasizes something also discovered in Susan's work. That is, now that Job has seen and experienced God, he is ready to move on with his life. As God testified in Job 42:7, Job had spoken rightly about God, so there was no need for him to repent. Rather, what Job needed was the restoration of God's presence, which seems to satisfy him, even though this does not answer a single complaint or question he had. God's timeless presence, the transformation experience, and the ministry that followed are key in Job and might well also be key in addressing issues of faith amidst intense suffering, be these in the life of biblical characters or survivors in the 21st century. Moreover, I do not think that attending to trauma victims can simply be treated as a nice addition to a proper biblical theology, as is often the case. As noted by David Carr earlier, the Bible is a text wrought with trauma and has survived at least in part because it testifies to suffering as well as life beyond it. The theologians in the Bible were ones that knew life in its rawest, harshest form, and yet, at least some of them, were still standing at the end of it. They were, in the words of Susan, the ones holding the microphone in ancient times. Here at the BGC, we can continue this process by making sure that we listen, really listen, to those who in the past have been silenced, and bring these voices to light, not only to shape what we do, but, dare I say it, transform it. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan and Kirsi, for your fantastic paper and response. It's a hard act to follow, but I'm going to try just for a short 10 minutes. Can everyone hear me at the back? Am I projecting enough? Yeah, good, okay. So, as both Susan and Kirsi have reminded us, the biblical text is potentially a source of terror as well as hope. It is a text that bears the hallmarks of trauma and of survival, but also of patriarchy and at times misogyny. While the Hebrew Bible in particular may be infused with the echoes of the trauma of a displaced and alienated people, the suffering is for the most part configured through male experience, often at the expense of women's bodies. Susan mentioned already Hagar, who is used and abused when the stability and the growth of the nation is under question, her enslaved foreign body raped and then discarded. In a second text we've already encountered this afternoon, when ancient Israel imagined tribal conflict, they conceive of this through the symbol of the broken female body, the Levite's concubine, sexually assaulted and maimed in Judges 19. As war breaks out between the 12 tribes following the attack on her, the division between these male-dominated groups is symbolised in the text by the 12 pieces of the abused woman's body being sent out through Israel as a call for justice against her wronged husband, or her wronged husband. These texts, then, provide us with an ethical challenge. How do we read these stories today? In the academy, in the church, in schools, in homes? What does it mean for women and men who have survived abuse and violence to encounter such dark and unsettling images of trauma? In recognising the challenging gender dynamics of biblical texts as they were written, so of course we must think carefully about the ways in which they are read and interpreted. At the beginning of Susan's fabulous talk, she mentioned one of the aims of the Research Centre. That is precisely to change the way the Bible is read. And so I want to spend my concluding 10 minutes, it might be slightly less than 10 minutes, thinking through this issue with the help of Susan and Kirsi's paper. How do we change the way the Bible is read? Of course, trying to answer this question has been an ongoing concern for feminist biblical scholars, for women in churches and in secular spaces, for LGBTQI+ people for decades, for centuries. Susan has provided us with one fantastic way of reading the Bible that reconfigures the text in the response to the experience of female survivors of domestic abuse, giving voice to those who have previously been denied the opportunity to influence the reading and the use of the Bible in church and in universities, anywhere in fact. So I want to reflect a little more broadly on some of the synergies that I can see emerging from Susan's work that are indicative of the kinds of activities we have planned for the Bible Gender and Research Centre, Church Research Centre. So I want to think further about how the work of practical theology and how the engagement with living readers of biblical texts can in turn shape approaches and methods within biblical studies. As Kirsi mentioned earlier, there's often a kind of divide between theology, theological work, and biblical studies, and I want to think about the synergy that we can find between those two. After all, it's only rather recently that those working in the field of biblical studies have begun to engage with the text as anything other than, as the Bible and Culture Collective have described it, an historic relic or an antiquarian artefact that could and should be mined for information about the authors of various biblical books or parts of biblical books, perhaps even single verses, and to glean details about the time those authors were living and writing. After all, the question that comes out of this is, well, is the Bible something that can be closed off and contained as soon as we have discerned what its ancient authors intended it to mean? Does that just stop? Does the reading process end at that point? As Susan and Kirsi's papers have so powerfully demonstrated, the Bible is a living text that is animated and informed by its readers as well as its writers. Without a reader, the words of Genesis and Judges and Job would remain silent and still on the page. Susan's engagement with and communication of real women's experience of trauma, the response they have to this trauma in the context of their faith, and the possible insights this may provide other readers of the Bible, should function as an encouragement to those working in the field of biblical studies to ask the very same questions that practical theologians and church practitioners and lay readers of the biblical text are asking. That is, what the Bible means rather than what the author meant. So, the history of the reception of the Bible, the exploration of myriad meaning and myths that have surrounded it through the centuries is paramount. It's not sufficient to explain the fate of Hagar or of the Levite's concubine as historical events, of sufferings from the distant past. As the Bible continues to be read and interpreted, these texts impact on and shape the lives of women and men, and so the academic study of these texts must recognise this fact. Secondly, Susan's research also eloquently highlights the importance of engaging with a range of interpreters and meanings they discern within the biblical text. As Susan states about her work with abused women and their faith, no one was listening to their story. Not only does Susan's research into the powerful expressions of faith made by women she encountered following their experiences of suffering draw our attention to the voiceless and suffering women of the Bible, to the Hagars and the Levites women, but it also encourages us to reevaluate the history of reading the Bible that is presented within academia today. Susan's paper serves not only as a call for the Bible Gender and Church Research Centre to investigate women's experience of the Bible today, but also to provide a space for engaging with women and LGBTQI+ people who have been reading Bible throughout the ages. If the meaning of the text is fully dynamic, being made and remade in association with the reader, then the history of interpretation is immediately problematic in view of minority readers, whose conversations with the biblical text have either been non-existent due to illiteracy, ignored, or undermined in our histories of the Bible and its impact on the church and culture. The dominant group of readers in Western culture, white, male, educated and Christian, have in effect made the text their own. The fewer voices that are allowed to interpret a text, the more meanings allocated by dominant readers come to appear as objective and true. It is precisely this type of gendered legitimacy that feminist and gender-sensitive reception critics can counter by bringing women's voices into play in their history of interpretation of biblical texts. As Susan says, and we've had this quote now 3 times, whoever holds the pen, the professor's chair, the pulpit or the microphone decides who we can hear from. For me, this is important for today, but also for our study of biblical texts and their historical afterlives. By failing to fully integrate women's voices into biblical reception history, biblical studies remains complicit in the monopolization of scripture by male, educated, European, American, heteronormative voices, and more importantly, the perpetuation of these readings. So, not only do we need to ask how women today read the stories of Hagar and the Levite's wife, although of course that is integral to the work we need to be doing, looking to the works of theologians like Phyllis Trible and Dolores Williams alongside the experiences of women in churches to help us to do so, but we must also think about the ways in which these texts have shaped women and men's experiences through the ages. What impact did these texts of terror have on women's lives in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th and 19th centuries? Through the interdisciplinary research, this inaugural lecture for the Bible, Gender and Church Research Centre urges us to begin to construct a gendered counter-history of biblical reading. It encourages us to ask how women and men have responded to biblical texts that have been used to legitimate domestic abuse and gendered violence, and to seek out the sources of marginalised readers through the ages that marginalised readers through the ages have turned to in order to free themselves. Susan and Kirsi encourage us to ask again, with greater conviction than ever, whose Bible is it anyway?
Thank you.